This reading is brought to you by Strong Women, Strange Worlds, which is a group of authors supporting authors. Our mission is to elevate the voices of women and other underrepresented gender identity authors of science fiction, fantasy, and horror through events like our bi-monthly virtual quick read sessions. You can find out more about Strong Women, Strange Worlds in the handout we've provided in the chat, or we will provide real soon now, and by visiting our website. I'm your host today, Sarah Smith, and you can find out more about me in the provided handout. Our first reader is Kyoko M. Kyoko M is the author of the Black Parade urban fantasy paranormal romance series and the Of Cinder and Bone science fiction series. She is also a contributor to Marvel Comics' Black Panther, Tales of Wakanda anthology. Kyoko, it's yours.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am so excited to read Of Claws and Inferno for you guys. This is the 5th book in the Of Cinder and Bone series. It actually came out on April 24th, 2022, and I will be doing a reading of that. I'm going to set my little timer here, and hopefully everybody enjoys it. I'm getting too old for this shit. Jack shut the door to the rental van and then walked around to the rear, keys jingling in his hands. He popped open the doors and smiled at the dragon inside as she yawned and stood up. Ready to work, girl? Pete shook herself as he climbed inside and unlocked her cage. She stepped out into the Georgia sun and onto the parking lot of the Brookhaven Country Club, which had been cleared out ahead of their arrival. Luckily, they'd managed to get a good day with no rain. The only other vehicle in the lot was the news van that had been following him since he landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport not too long ago. He envied Libby. She'd only had one cameraman to put up with, but he'd been assigned to a small team. The reason Bellwether had been that the scavenger dragon was notoriously hard to catch on film. There were only small snippets available, and while by now the witnesses could describe it, no one had ever caught more than a minute's worth of footage due to its mostly nocturnal behavior and its liquid fast movements. Even the nighttime security cameras at the malls where it had stolen jewelry hadn't gotten clear looks at the dragon. That being said, Jack didn't trust Bellwether's word. He had a hunch that they wanted heavier coverage with him being popular among the dragon hunters. He hadn't turned the footage on yet, but he suspected the same amount of attention would be given to Beowulf. They were capitalizing on them to drive up ratings and whatever profit could be drained from the airing of the tournament. It annoyed him deeply, given that he wanted to do the right thing for the dragons, not become an entertainer. All right, girlie, Jack said, reaching into one of the dividers in the back of the van and pulling out a sealed plastic baggie. Inside was a patch of skin shed by the scavenger dragon that someone had found on the golf course behind them. He'd met with the Department of Natural Resources after he landed, and they gave him the skin as well as the data they'd been able to collect so far. He opened the baggie and held the skin out to the dragon. Let's see what you can find. Pete stooped her head and sniffed the dragon skin. She did so for about 10 seconds and then turned away from him, her nostrils flaring. She spared a glance at the camera crew a few spaces down, which made them freeze in place, and Jack chuckled under his breath before moving forward towards the greenway. Jack shut the van doors and locked it, then called out to the crew. Relax, she's on the case. Just make sure you give her a wide berth, maybe 3 or 4 yards. She's not aggressive, but she doesn't like strangers. They gave him a thumbs up, and he trailed after Pete, tucking the skin sample into his belt just in case she needed a refresher. He'd had to make a choice for what to bring with him, the net launcher or Libby's new tranquilizer rifle. He'd gone for the rifle. Based on what little footage there was, he'd never be able to catch the scavenger dragon in a net. It had reflexes like a feral cat, from what he'd seen, and he lived on a farm long enough to know you couldn't catch a feral cat very easily. The scavenger dragon had been spotted here multiple times, either sunbathing or drinking water and catching a few fish in a small lake. The golf course was less than 2 miles from Phipps Plaza and Lenox Mall. The dragon would want somewhere quiet, away from the noise of Atlanta, and away from people, to stash its treasures. The golf course was strictly maintained, so that was why the landscapers caught on immediately to the strangely large mounds dug into the ground on the outer edges of the fairway. However, Jack didn't suspect the dragon's den would be here. It probably had decided to make this its hunting ground. The scavenger dragon fed primarily on woodland creatures and the occasional freshwater fish, and this area would have plenty of both. It could burrow on and off the grounds with relative ease, especially at night when no one would be on the course. Flying would take even less time, and he was pretty sure it would be around today. Pete led him into a sand trap and found her first clue that the dragon had been there recently, droppings. Jack knelt and scanned the feces into his forearm device for later analysis, wrinkling his nose at the stench. Well, it's definitely on the premises because that's one horrifically fresh turd. Thanks for that. Pete snorted at him. Jack knew what that meant. Yes, you have a point. It does smell far worse to you than it does to me. Still, though, dragon poop is one of the worst parts of this job. She flung sand in his general direction, and he chuckled again. All right. I'll shut up and let you concentrate. After she inspected the sand trap thoroughly, Pete climbed out, shaking off the sand, and continued across the golf course to the wooded area on the outskirts. There were various patches of trees throughout the land, nothing dense like a forest, but enough to shade one comfortably in certain spots. She walked for a few yards and then stopped when she reached a winding path that went past another patch of trees. Pete sat and folded her wings, staring ahead steadily without moving. Jack knew what that meant too. Pay dirt. He took his binoculars off his belt and looked through them. The stretch of trees were roughly 10 yards away. They were downwind, which worked to their benefit since he spotted a scavenger dragon in a thicket. Unlike the dark-backed worm, the scavenger dragon hadn't gotten any larger. It was still about the size of a Labrador or a golden retriever. The sunlight didn't glint off of its dull brown scales. It blended in amazingly well with the dirt and loam beneath it, making it harder to see from a distance. It was currently pulling off furry chunks of a wild rabbit carcass. Gray fur scattered through the air and settled around it like a carpet of morbid cotton balls. All right, this way, girl, Jack murmured, patting her side. They were on level ground with it, so they needed to take cover before it spotted them. Pete's green scales would blend into the grass, but certainly not Jack's gray suit, so they slipped into another thicket nearby. Jack motioned for the camera crew to back up, and they retreated into a nearby sand trap to stay out of sight. Jack touched the control panel on his helmet to hail Shannon. I've got eyes on our scaly little thief. Roger that. Do you have a clear shot? Jack admitted. It's decent, but not ideal. I'll do my best. Cross your crusty old fingers for me. I'll be sure to do that, Shannon said dryly. Jack slid the tranquilizer rifle around to his hands and set up the tripod to hold it steady. He prepped it the way Libby had shown him and flattened to the ground, taking careful aim. He settled in and let his heartbeat slow, then his breathing, concentrating the crosshairs on the dragon's lighter scales on his underbelly. On most species, the belly scales were thinner and could be penetrated more easily by a syringe, but not always. He'd have one shot and one shot only from here. Jack moved his finger over the trigger. He took a deep breath and then let it out slowly. Then he pulled the trigger. And right before he did, one of the camera crew members sneezed. Achoo! The scavenger dragon pushed up on all fours, its head snapping around in the direction of the sand trap. Jack's shot missed, flying underneath it and hitting the tree trunk behind it. The scavenger dragon hissed and spread its dark wings, taking off into the air. God damn it. Jack collapsed the rifle's tripod and slung the weapon around his back before leaping onto Pete's saddle. Let's go. Pete got a running start and took off into the sky after the fleeing scavenger dragon. The brown dragon screeched once it spotted them behind it and flew northwest of the golf course. And speed was the name of the game. The scavenger dragon's wings parted the air, and it took only seconds for Jack to know they wouldn't be able to keep up. Pete was a heavy dragon, even with her streamlined body, and he was a full-grown man. Their combined weight would hold them back, and it only had to contend with being 60 or so pounds. He had to catch it alive, which meant blinding it would cause it to fall to its death. He didn't have the net launcher with him, and at this altitude, the rifle wouldn't make the shot. They were going to lose it, even if only temporarily. The scavenger dragon dove sharply towards the ground. Jack used his helmet's heads-up display and focused to see where it headed. He spotted a large drainage pipe to the right of a street and cursed under his breath. Seconds later, the scavenger dragon spread its wings out to glide and then pulled them into its side, allowing it to fit perfectly inside. Jack and Pete landed a moment later, but with Pete's size, it would be impossible to follow it. He flipped on his flashlight and checked the drainage pipe. It was the kind that was built into a hill, and the creature could get around easily without being seen. Jack groaned and leaned against Pete's side. Back to square one.
Kyoko, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed it.
Our second reader is Missy Jane. Missy Jane is the alter ego of a married mother of 4 who was born and raised in Texas. She spends most of her time lost in worlds of her own making, alternately loving and hating such creatures as vampires, shapeshifters, archangels, and gargoyles, to name only a few. Missy, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Missy Jane. I'm also MJ Aragon on Facebook. My Gargoyle Masters series is it's a fantasy romance series about 12 brothers created by wizards to protect the human realm. Each book is about 2 couples, and this is a snippet of Astrid and Orestes' story. Astrid barely had the chance to look around before Orestes pushed open a door and strode inside. The room was pitch black, but he seemed to have no trouble navigating his way through. As he walked deeper inside, Astrid gasped and clung to his shirt when he leaned down and gently placed her on a soft surface. "If you don't let go, I can't light the fire." Amusement was unmistakable in his voice, and Astrid released his shirt in annoyance. She sat up on what she assumed was his bed while his shadowed form moved away from her and back toward the door. "Is this your room?" she asked, her whispered voice seeming to fade into the blackness. He closed the door, and she tried to ignore her spark of fear at hearing the lock turn. She would never have expected to find herself lying in one of the master's beds, locked in his room for some unknown purpose. Whether he truly meant to tend to her wounds, she didn't know, but running seemed impossible now. He moved silently around the room, and she couldn't see even a hint of him. Then a hiss sounded a few feet away, and she had to close her eyes against the abrupt glow of flame. He stood, a dark silhouette against the bright flames in his large stone fireplace. "Yes, this is my room. Do you like it?" His voice seemed deeper, more intimate, as he slowly made his way back to her. She swallowed and looked up, but the light behind him left his face in shadows and hid his expression. Yes, it's very nice." He chuckled and turned away from her, removing the long dark leather coat he seemed to prefer. She realized why when he slipped it off his broad shoulders, revealing multiple weapons. Astrid was about to pull her legs into a more comfortable position when she noticed the dirt caked on them. Shame burned through her, heating her cheeks as she quickly moved to the side of the bed and slipped off. "What is it? What's wrong?" Orestes was suddenly at her side. For such a large man, he moved quickly and almost silently. Astrid gasped and took a step back from him, clinging to the edge of the bed. "My feet, they're too dirty for your nice bed." Annoyance flashed across his expression, but at least it wasn't anger. Astrid realized she was growing comfortable in his presence, a dangerous habit to be sure. Still, when he ran a hand down his face and wariness filled her gaze, she couldn't help but feel better at the human gesture. "I'll return shortly," he said, before stalking out of the room. She looked at the closed door in indecision. He obviously expected her to stay put and hadn't threatened her in any way thus far. Should she await his return? Doubts filled her, and she shivered as cold from the stone floor raced up her legs. The warm glow of the fire beckoned, and Astrid went willingly as she crossed the vast space from his bed to fireplace. She noticed Orestes' room was much larger than she had realized. Additional large tapestries lined the walls, and various furs covered most of the floor. Thick curtains covered the window, hiding the night from her eyes. His massive bed could easily sleep 6 people, even with the large man in the middle. That image sent a surge of jealousy racing through her, and she shook her head at her ridiculousness. The masters belonged to no women, especially not human women. It was said they left the realm to bed the race of warrior women in Kiva when the mood took them. The journey to the neighboring realm went from a 10-day journey to a matter of hours once the gargoyles spread their wings. Astrid shuddered at the thought. She'd only seen a gargoyle in flight once, and it had been an awesome sight. It still amazed her how their wings disappeared when they took human form. Aside from his bed, the only other furniture in the room was a wardrobe and desk. There was also a large chest at the foot of his bed, big enough for a human to fit inside. Astrid frowned and looked away from it. Her eyes landed on a desk piled high with books. She'd heard a servant mention a library somewhere in the castle. Astrid had taught herself to read simple words over the years and longed to own just one book. She'd secretly hoped she would be assigned to dust the library so she could at least look at them. Faced with the bounty on Orestes' desk, she couldn't help but wander over and stare in fascination at the stack. It reached her chin and hid, a closer inspection revealed, a similar stack behind it. She reached a shaking hand to touch the top book when Orestes' voice sounded in her ear. "You know how to read?" She screamed and leapt away, hitting her hip against the desk hard enough to send both stacks of books tumbling down. Oh no! Astrid was nearly in tears over the mess she'd made and threw herself on the floor, grabbing books and stacking them as quickly as she could in an effort to clean the mess. She felt more than heard Orestes bend down beside her, but rather than help, he gently grabbed her wrists. "Stop, lady, don't fret over this." Her head snapped up and she tried to pull from his grasp. He released her and she moved back, falling on her bottom in her effort to get out of his reach. "I'm sorry, my lord. I'm so sorry. Please just stop." He released a breath and swiped the books out of his way, crawling toward her while she continued to slide back. She reached the wall and shut her eyes, throwing her arms over her head. "No, don't do that again. How can I convince you that I mean you no harm?" The exasperation in his voice finally penetrated her fear, and Astrid lowered her arms. He was sitting back on his legs, a whisper away, staring down at her with concern. When he realized she was watching, he reached out and gently moved her arms down until they rested on her chest. "What is your name?" She swallowed her fear and answered in a whisper, "Astrid." His eyebrows shot up, and a sudden grin made him even more handsome. "Astrid, how about that? Tell me, my little star, how did you come to be in my home?" She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What should she tell him about the hardships of her life? Would he really care that she'd been left all alone in the world with no one to care about her, no way to eat, nowhere to sleep? Those were the concerns of humans, and she was one of the lowest of the low, a peasant and servant. A master wouldn't care about that so long as she was safely in Halstrad and not in any danger. He frowned at her hesitation before sighing and leaning back. She closed her still gaping mouth while he stood and reached for her. "Come, I've arranged a bath for you." That got her attention. "Bath?" She eagerly grabbed onto his hand and he pulled her to her feet. Obviously sensing her excitement, he smiled and led her from his room. "Yes, a warm bath. Then I'll put a healing ointment on that wound. No sense doing that until you're clean." Shame colored her cheeks as she considered how badly she looked. Astrid knew she was plain, a little mousy-looking thing, small and insignificant, covered in dirt and bruises. She'd never expected to be so closely watched by a master. Orestes must think she was a mess, smelly and dirty from sleeping on the floor of the kitchens. Though she tried as hard as she could to stay clean, she wasn't given much opportunity to wash her body, much less her clothes. A bath would take care of the worst of her appearance, though she couldn't help the scars in her stature. With a sigh of resignation, she went willingly through a door across the hall from his room. I think I have a little bit of time just to say that my link goes to all of my social media, and there are currently 3 books available in this series. The 4th book is in the works.
Thank you. Thank you, Missy. Can you hear me? Good. No, you can't hear me. You can hear me? Good. Our third reader is Heather Rose Jones. Heather Rose Jones is an industrial failure analyst for a biotech pharmaceutical company, an amateur historian specializing in queer women's history, and an author of historical and fantasy stories. In her spare time, she enjoys gardening, bicycling, and wondering where all the time goes, as well as wearing really cool necklaces. Heather, it's yours.
I'll be reading from the chapter in which we introduce the fairy who has laid the curse on the beast and on his sister. "Ah, Perenelle, you are patient now. Patient enough to stand outside the gates of Betancourt for days to see what might befall. You were not so patient when you were, but no, you were not young then. It has been very long since you were young, hasn't it? The Fae are young only once, and old for a very long time. But one may be impatient at any age. Do you remember when you were young, Paranel? Do you remember the glittering halls of Tortoisbean and the guests your parents hosted for balls and hunting parties? How they would ride out to slip between the worlds and tease those in mortal lands. Do you remember learning to walk the worlds for yourself? How to draw the glamour after you to hide the truth from mortal eyes? Do you remember how it felt to be new come into your power and uncertain? To make mistakes? But one may be foolish and make mistakes at any age. Isn't that so, Paranel? There was no need for patience then. You were eager to seize the world in your hands, to touch each seed of promise and feel it grow beneath your fingers. Green and growing things were your gift. You knew how the world worked in the certainty of your power. Your parents left Tortoisbean in your keeping and went to walk the worlds again. That is what Fae do when they see their children grown and settled. Your fame and power increased. You were certain of the shape your life would take. The world had rules, and you knew them as you knew the stone walls of Tortoisbean. You knew with a certainty beyond doubt where your path would lead. Just as you had thrived in your parents' affection, you knew what love to expect from a husband, from a child. But the world has plans of its own. She was the child of your heart, wasn't she, Paranel? You hadn't yet thought to contemplate a child of your body. No man, whether of the Fae or of mortal lands, had yet sparked the fire you knew would someday come. You were patient. But oh, they brought her to you, a shy and weeping child, hoping that you could lift her curse. It was no curse, was it? Simply a gift gone awry. With every sob and hiccup, flowers and jewels fell from her dainty lips. Violets and asphodel, pearls and rubies, gillyflowers and columbine, sharp, brilliant diamonds and cruel, sweet, thorny roses, tearing her lips and throat until she screamed. And you, Paranel, you took her in your arms and kissed her bleeding lips, tasting of rose and violet, and promised to teach her how to shape her gift. The mouth was for words and kisses, you said. Sorcery belonged to the hands. She struck you to the heart, didn't she, Paranel? Her parents poured out their gratitude and relief and promised you anything you desired. And you found you desired a daughter, a child to teach the language of green and growing things. What could they do? They left her to your care. That's what Fae do, isn't it? They leave. There was no need for patience then, Paranel. She was the daughter of your heart, the student of your dreams. She grew and learned and blossomed. She was the darling of your guests, the joy of every ball, plucking flowers and bright jewels out of the air and speaking in the language of roses. She drew the eye of the Dufortignes, the masters of Betancourt, and they begged, "Let her come to visit our son Philippe, now he has grown to mastery. It is time for us to walk the worlds, and he needs a wife to steady him, an alliance to build his influence. Let her come to see if they suit." You weren't ready to let her go yet, were you, Paranel? She was your darling and your child. No other love had come to claim your heart, no one who fit the shape you'd saved for him in your life. But she laughed and said that though she had no mind to wed just yet, she wished to visit Betancourt. You brought her there in pomp and celebration. And because you didn't care to return alone to Tortoisbean, you went to travel distant lands and play with mortal lives. You promised to return, a year and a day. And then, if she wished, there would be a wedding such as not been seen in a mortal lifetime. The world had rules, and you would follow them. A year and a day. You never doubted you would see her again, did you, Paranel? You returned, and she was gone, with all her retinue, and no one would say a word. You raged, and you warned, and you pleaded, and no one would tell you where she had gone or why, not cruel Philippe, nor silent Grace. You cursed yourself that you hadn't seen their hearts before. So many things you didn't see. The world had rules, and when they stepped outside the bounds, they drew their own doom. You cursed yourself with words, but you cursed them with ancient power. You cursed them as you saw them, the cruel beast and the silent stone. Ah, yes, so many things you didn't see. You had no patience then, Perenelle. You meant the curse as a punishment, as a threat to loosen their tongues. Surely they must know where your child had gone, what had sent her fleeing from Betancourt. But Philippe only laughed. He knew the laws that bound you, and that every curse must have its key. You made that key as cruel as his laughter. And then you left to search for your daughter through every world you knew. 6 years you sought her, locked in anguish and despair, and never found a trace. Then 6 more, wandering alone, seeking solace, as Tortoisbean fell to empty ruin. You thought a mortal interlude might heal your heart. You thought him a simple, uncomplicated man. He adored you with the love you always thought to win. He promised you anything your heart desired, and you thought to fill your empty arms with mortal children to erase that other loss. But mortal men cannot be trusted with a heart. You discovered that, didn't you, Perenelle? You married him with vows and words within a church that trapped you in his world and thought you could be content. He promised you everything your heart desired, but he lied. That's what mortals do. They lie. His selfish faithlessness set you free. You, but not your mortal children. They were too young to make that choice. They had been signed with holy water, and their blood still bound them to that world. You could not take them, and you would not stay. And so you left. That's what Fae do, isn't it, Perenelle? Oh, but Perenelle, yeah, now you have learned patience. If you have not been granted the love you were promised, you can still punish those who broke your heart. You set your spies at Betancourt, and every time they raise the glamour to let the mortal world in, you know. Nothing comes of it. You can't pierce their defenses, but you know that much. If the Dufortignes had succeeded in enticing an innocent within those walls, if one of them had known and offered true love, you would have felt it when the chains broke. Their glamour is fraying now as the curse comes near fulfillment. You know that calendar written in your bones. 3 days and 3 and 30 years, a span to conjure with. Nearly the whole of it is accomplished. If those two succeed at the last, you will be there to witness. And if they fail, you will witness that as well, and your heart will find its rest. Now, the gates have opened once more, both those of iron and those of sorcery, and you wait outside to see what may befall. You are patient now.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Heather Rose. Our fourth reader is Sue Burke. Sue Burke's most recent science fiction novel is Immunity Index, which just came out as a trade paperback. She's also written the science fiction duology, Semiosis. Is it Semiosis or Semosis? And Interference, along with short stories, poems, and essays. She is a literary translator from Spanish into English. And I've just lost the rest of it. Just a moment. Just a moment. Here we go. And she currently enjoys life in Chicago. Sue, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to read from chapter 1 of Immunity Index. Irene watched the woolly mammoth shuffle aimlessly. His yard-long shaggy hair gleamed rust brown in the afternoon light. For all his huge magnificence, Nimki looked desolate, pitiful, even out of place, although 10,000 years ago, his kind had dominated North America's grasslands. He stopped dead in his bear pen and rocked back and forth, looked at Irene and rumbled. He recognized her as a source of food, but perhaps not as the person who cherished him more than anyone else did. She got back to work and shoved a bale of grassy hay into the chains that hung from the sling of the crane alongside the pen. The bale weighed half of what she did. Every day, he'd eat 7 bales, along with fruit, fresh-cut long grass and alfalfa, a pail of elephant chow pellets, vegetables, and more. A 1/4 ton of fodder every day. She switched on the motorized winch to lift up the bale and directed the crane's arm to swing over the outer fence, marshy moat, and interior fence, then dropped the hay. Immediately, she reversed the motor to reel up the chains as Nimki rushed at them, jerking his trunk in the air and grabbing at them. He could move gracefully when he wanted, but now he was unhappy. He had reason to be unhappy. So did Irene. Alan, the head of the family that owned the farm, was leaving the house. Is he coming to help me, she thought. Not likely. Nimki gave up on the chains, roared, and ripped apart the bale of hay. A crow cawed on the fence next to the pen, oblivious to the grassy funk of mammoth droppings. The pen desperately needed to be cleaned. Alan came and leaned on the fence. We thought this was going to be a great idea, our own little zoo with a big star animal to show off. It's just not working out. Well, maybe, she thought. No one wants to visit a sad, stinky animal. She began to load some apples into a box for Nimki. I was thinking about getting some passenger pigeons. Maybe that would bring more people. They could visit central Wisconsin the way it used to be. Well, they'd never guess by the way it was now, she knew. Visitors saw endless industrial farms covering sweltering land that only a half-century earlier had held cool, beautiful forests. Worse, the farm corporations were pushing for travel restrictions like the ones in Iowa, which would mean no visitors at all. You know, Alan said, I thought I'd feel connected to him. I'm a little Ojibwa. My ancestors knew about mammoths firsthand. That's why we called him Nimki. The name Nimki meant thunderbird in Ojibwa. A Missouri exotic animal breeding farm had raised him with an elephant surrogate mother and had called him Big Babar. Irene knew a little about the breeding operation and liked none of it. Nimki had suffered a cheerless childhood in a pen even smaller than the one where it lived now. Alan said, there's always so much to do, and the cost for alfalfa just keeps going up. He eats too much. He shrugged and returned to the farmhouse. A twittering flock of sparrows was scavenging inside the pen for bugs in the mammoth scat. Nimki rumbled, glaring at them as if they were stealing his dinner. In July, when Irene had arrived as an unpaid intern, her heart had broken the moment she'd seen the woolly mammoth. Or rather, it had broken when she saw his pen. 6 acres had looked bigger in the photos. They showed him standing in a lush tall grass prairie under wide oak trees, wildflowers brushing his belly. But in real life, the pen resembled an inadequate prison exercise yard. The grass and flowers had been eaten or trampled to bare sandy soil, and the savanna oaks ripped apart. 6 acres, just over 4 football fields, was nowhere near enough for a creature who in the wild might range more than 30 miles in a single day. Irene had not expected love at first sight, and now she dreamed of somehow petting him as he towered over her. But if he behaved like a wild adult male elephant, no one could come close. He would assert dominance, and with a casual swipe, he could kill. She hadn't expected love. But was his existence ethical? With only 12 other mammoths alive in North America, he might be alone his whole life, condemned to solitary confinement. Male elephants seemed like loners, but actually led social lives at least as complex as a human's. Humans in solitary confinement went mad. He lived in a little pen at a failing farm where the house had fading siding, the barn had a leaking roof, the shed sat on a cracked foundation, and the driveway needed a fresh layer of gravel. On some days, no visitors came to help pay for his fodder. She took the tractor to cut some alfalfa for Nimki, hoping to distract herself, but she thought of nothing else the whole time. if she hadn't fallen in love with Nimki, if things didn't change soon for the better, much better, she'd pack her suitcase and go.
Wow. That's so touching. Thank you, Sue. Our final reader is Mari Ness. Short fiction author and poet Mari Ness has been featured in Tor.com, Clock's World, Uncanny, Lightspeed, Nightmare, Apex, Nature Futures, Diametrical Plats, Fireside, Daily Science Fiction, and multiple other venues. Wow. For more, check Twitter at Mari_Ness or marikness.wordpress.com. That'll be in the chat in a moment. Mari, it's yours.
So this is not what I originally planned to read, but I thought we could use maybe a little bit of humor after the dying mammoths. So let's try this. So you want to reach the witch at the edge of the void. 1, no, you don't. 2, trust us on this. Personal experience. You're really going to insist on this? Well, first, prepare to spend a lot of credits. And we do mean a lot of credits. Enough money to buy a medium-ranked planet was what we heard, and that turned out to be an underestimate. Of course, you can buy your own ship, but one capable of getting you there will probably cost you enough money to buy a low-ranked planet. Consider just buying your own planet instead. Because, and we can't stress this too strongly, she's out on the edge of the void, which is off the major passenger routes for a reason. Sure, you can find the occasional inhabited planet out there in the far, far ends of the spiral arms, but almost all of them, including the one she supposedly comes from, are small or violent or miserable or some combination of the lot, and you'll almost certainly have to stop at one at least to avoid space madness. And yes, this includes her own planet. The red light that bathes its surface is deceptive. The planet is cold and dusty and cold. We're not big fans of calling planets after a single feature, but in this case, we're willing to call it misery. Security, probably. Good half of the galaxy probably wants her dead at this point. Maybe she just likes looking out into the void, thinking of all the galaxies she'll never visit. We did call the place misery. And oh yes, she is the most beautiful creature of your species that you have ever seen, of any species. It's all a trick, of course, but it's a good one. And oh yes, she's said to have an insatiable appetite for attractive persons of all genders and species, both sexually and gustatorially. That's not a trick, just a rumor, and one we can't confirm from personal experience. But we do know that fortunes and planets have been thrown at her feet for the pleasure of spending a single night with her, despite the dust and the cold. Her spells cost even more. Trust us. Oh, and the cost, a near shipload of island items, jewels, rare elements, even 2 small kittens that we thought she might enjoy, associated as they are with her profession. A gray kitten and an orange kitten. How did you? You don't really need us to answer these questions. You just wanted to know if we'd been there. If you'd identified the right targets. And now you've let us identify the right targets. No. We can't put our weapons down or stop the incoming robots. Neither can you. She is, after all, a witch and very good at her job. We did tell you that you didn't really want to reach her. And that's the end of that story. It looks like I have a couple more minutes left, so I'm going to flip over to a poem, which is called Good People. It somewhat reflects my feelings at the moment with certain elements of our society. Good people. Later, they said it was the way she kept watching the sky, the way she kept bending to stare at the castle swans, the way they kept finding nettles scattered in her bed, the way the servants saw her stealing through the gates at night, the way the prince had fallen in love so suddenly, all reason surely to send her to the stake. Not her silence. Oh no. And not the scars on her hands. They were quite decent people, you understand, all of them, even the queen, concerned only with the safety of son and kingdom, even the ministers urging death, even the crowd cheering on the flames. Good people, all with good reasons, all to think the girl an ogre, a witch, a monster in disguise. Not people who would condemn a girl with scars on her wrists or condemn a girl who could not speak. No, good people, decent, kind-hearted, all with good reasons to burn a girl at the stake. Afterwards, others crept in to pick over the remains, saying not a word when the white feathers and blood clung to their bandages, their canes. And later, when they told the tale, they said it had a happy ending. That the king was good, as was the queen. They were good people, after all, quite decent and good at telling tales. The end.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Wow. 5 wonderful readings. Thank you so much to everyone who came today